The hands never stopped moving, even in sleep. They danced across invisible threads, weaving stories that existed only in memory now. In the winter of 1491, these weathered fingers held the entire bloodline of the Deer clan between their palms. 7 generations of births, deaths, triumphs, and sorrows, all waiting to be transformed into the sacred textile that would preserve their legacy forever. But time was running out. The old woman they belonged to sat hunched over her loom as the first snow began to fall outside the bark-covered longhouse. Her name was She Who Remembers All, though most simply called her grandmother. Her eyes, once sharp enough to spot a hawk circling miles away, now struggled to distinguish between the crimson of bloodroot dye and the deep amber of butternut bark. Yet her hands, her hands, they remembered everything. The pattern she wove was not merely decoration. Each thread carried the weight of a soul, each color the essence of a life lived. The deep indigo spirals represented her great-great-grandmother, the woman who had first learned the sacred art of memory weaving from the sky people themselves during the time of first teaching, when the boundary between earth and sky was thin as morning mist, and wisdom flowed freely between the worlds. That ancient woman, known as Thread Speaker, had been gathering berries on the sacred mountain when the sky people descended in their robes of starlight. They found her crying beside a stream, mourning the recent death of her youngest daughter, a girl whose laughter had been like birdsong at dawn. The sky people, moved by her grief, offered to teach her a way to preserve not just the memory of the lost child, but the essence of all who had lived and would live in her bloodline. "Weaving is prayer made visible," they had told her, their voices like wind through silver leaves. "Each thread is a breath, each pattern a heartbeat, each color a moment of joy or sorrow, captured forever." They showed her how to prepare the sacred dyes using water collected during the new moon, how to spin thread from plants grown in soil blessed by the 7 directions, how to create patterns that would speak across the generations to those who had eyes to see and hearts to understand. The golden threads that now danced beneath She Who Remembers All's fingers spoke of her grandfather's legendary hunt, when he had tracked the great white elk for 17 days and nights through territory no human had ever mapped. The elk, massive as a small mountain and wise as the oldest oak, had led him through tests of endurance and courage that would have broken lesser men. On the 5th day, the elk led him through a blizzard so fierce that ice formed on his eyelashes, making it nearly impossible to see more than an arm's length ahead. On the 9th day, they crossed a river swollen with spring melt, the water so cold and fast that each step threatened to sweep him away to his death. On the 13th day, they climbed peaks so high that the air became thin as spider's silk, leaving him gasping and dizzy with each labored breath. But her grandfather persevered, driven not by hunger, but by the knowledge that this was more than a hunt. It was a test of his worthiness to lead the clan through the difficult seasons ahead. The white elk was a messenger from the spirit world, and to earn its gift, he would have to prove himself worthy not just as a hunter, but as a protector of his people. On the 17th day, as the sun rose over a valley hidden so deep in the mountains that no wind had ever disturbed its ancient stillness, the elk finally stopped. It turned to face the hunter, its eyes holding the wisdom of countless winters, and spoke in a voice like distant thunder. "You have followed far and suffered much. Now choose. Take my life and feed your people through the coming hard times, or spare me and learn the secret of plenty that will serve your children's children." Her grandfather, exhausted beyond measure but still capable of wisdom, chose knowledge over immediate gain. The elk taught him the locations of hidden valleys where game was always plentiful, the secret signs that revealed where the earth held stores of wild rice and maple sap, the songs that would call fish from the deepest waters even in the coldest months. When the teaching was complete, the elk vanished like morning mist, but its gift remained. The hunter returned to his village with enough knowledge to keep the deer clan fed and prosperous for generations. The golden threads in the textile captured not just the story of the hunt, but the essence of the wisdom gained, each gleaming fiber a pathway to abundance, each careful stitch a guarantee that the clan would never know true hunger as long as the pattern remained intact and its meaning understood. As her fingers worked the shuttle back and forth, the textile began to reveal its secrets. A band of rich green told the story of her uncle's gift for growing corn so tall it seemed to touch the clouds. Thin silver lines marked the path her cousin had taken when she married into the Wolf clan, creating an alliance that had kept peace between the tribes for 3 generations. And there, worked in careful knots of copper-colored thread, was the birth pattern of her own daughter, the child who had lived only 2 winters before the coughing sickness took her away. The winter preparation had always been sacred work. While the men gathered the last of the fallen timber and the young women preserved the final harvest, she who remembers all would spend the darkest months creating the clan's memory textile. This particular winter felt different, though. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was ending. The old stories spoke of such times, moments when the world balanced on the edge of a great change, and the old ways had to be preserved before they were swept away forever. Her hands paused for just a moment, hovering over the loom. The pattern she was creating would be her masterpiece, the culmination of 7 decades of learning, remembering, and weaving. But would her failing eyes allow her to complete it? Would there be enough time to capture every story, every face, every precious detail that made their people who they were? The young girl sitting beside her, her great niece, Bright Star, watched with wide eyes as the textile took shape. The longhouse was filled with the soft sounds of winter preparation, the gentle scraping of corn kernels being ground into meal, the quiet conversations of women mending clothing and tools, the occasional cry of an infant being soothed back to sleep. But around she who remembers all and her loom, there was a circle of reverent silence, as if the very air recognized the sacred nature of the work being performed. "Tell me about the blue threads, grandmother," she whispered, careful not to disturb the sacred work. "Ah, the blue." The old woman's voice carried the weight of winter wind through bare branches. "That is your great-great-grandfather, the one we called Stormwalker. He was born during the worst blizzard in living memory, when the snow fell so thick that hunters became lost just steps from their own lodges. The midwives said they had never seen such a birth. The child emerged as silent as falling snow, his eyes the color of deep water under winter ice." Her fingers paused as she selected the next thread, this one a shade darker than the others, like the blue of twilight before the first stars appear. But instead of bringing misfortune, as some feared, his birth seemed to calm the storm. The wind died down moment by moment as his first cries filled the lodge. The snow stopped falling grain by grain, and by morning the sun was shining so bright it turned the whole world into diamonds scattered across endless white. As she spoke, her fingers continued their ancient dance, blue threads interwoven with white, creating a pattern that seemed to move like snow in moonlight, each intersection catching the firelight and throwing it back in tiny sparks of reflected brilliance. The weave was so fine that it seemed almost to breathe, expanding and contracting with each subtle change in the light. "He grew up to be our greatest weather reader," she continued, her voice taking on the rhythm of an old song. "He could smell rain 3 days before it came, feel thunder in his bones before the first cloud appeared. When he was only 12 winters old, he warned the village of a flash flood that would have swept away half our lodges. The adults didn't believe him at first. The sky was clear, not a cloud to be seen. But he had felt the storm building in the mountains, felt the snow melting too fast in the high places where no human foot had ever walked." Bright Star leaned closer, studying the way the blue threads caught the firelight. She could almost see the patterns within patterns, the way each thread related to its neighbors, like words in a story she was only beginning to understand. Did they listen to him? Eventually, when the wind began to shift and the birds fell silent, the clan mothers remembered the boy's gift. They ordered the evacuation of the lower lodges just in time. That night, the water came roaring down the valley like a brown serpent, destroying everything in its path. But our people were safe on higher ground, thanks to Stormwalker's warning. The old woman's voice grew softer, more distant, as she worked a particularly complex section of the pattern. The other clans heard of his gift, of course. Word travels fast along the trading paths, especially word of power. They would send messengers, sometimes walking for days through dangerous territory, begging him to tell them when to plant, when to harvest, when to seek shelter from storms that hadn't even formed yet. He never refused them, never demanded payment. He said the weather belonged to everyone, like the sun and the moon and the turning of the seasons. As she spoke, the textile seemed to come alive beneath her hands. The blue section expanded and flowed, connecting to other colors, other stories. Here, a thread of silver marked a frost that came 3 days early, saving the corn from a plague of insects. There, a line of white showed the path of a beneficial wind that carried rain clouds to drought-stricken villages. And everywhere, the deep blue presence of Stormwalker, reading the sky's secret language and sharing its wisdom with any who needed it. But his greatest feat, she who remembers all continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, came during the year of 7 storms. You've heard the elders speak of it, the season when the sky spirits seemed to war among themselves, sending cyclone after cyclone across the land. Entire forests were flattened. Rivers changed their courses overnight. Many clans lost everything, forced to wander like ghosts through the devastation. Her hands moved more quickly now, weaving in threads of gray and black, colors that spoke of destruction and loss. But always, the blue threads remained, steady and strong, holding the pattern together even in the midst of chaos. Stormwalker felt them coming, all 7 of them, like a great drumbeat in the earth itself. He spent 3 days and nights without sleep, moving from village to village, warning everyone he could reach. Some listened. Others. She shook her head sadly. Others thought he had been touched by madness, claiming that so many storms in one season was impossible. Bright Star felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind rattling the longhouse walls. What happened to those who didn't listen? The first storm took the eastern villages. The second destroyed the settlements along Rapid Creek. By the third storm, everyone was listening. They followed Stormwalker's guidance, moved when he told them to move, sheltered where he told them to shelter. He saved thousands of lives that season, maybe tens of thousands. But the effort... The old woman's hands trembled slightly as she worked a section of faded blue thread, the color of sky seen through morning mist. The effort nearly killed him. After the 7th storm passed, he collapsed and slept for 4 days straight. When he woke, his hair had turned white as snow, though he was still a young man. And his gift... She paused, searching for the right words. His gift was changed. He could still read the weather, but now he read other things too. The future. The deep currents that flow beneath the surface of time. Is that how he knew about the pale men in the great canoes? She who remembers all nodded slowly. That vision came to him in his final years. He saw them coming across the endless waters, bringing gifts that were also curses, promises that were also lies. He saw our children speaking in foreign tongues, our sacred places becoming empty, our memories fading like smoke on the wind. And he saw this. She gestured to the loom, to the growing textile. He saw the need to preserve everything in the one way that might survive the coming storm. The fire crackled and spit, sending shadows dancing across the intricate patterns already completed. In the shifting light, the textile seemed almost alive, its threads pulsing with their own inner rhythm. Bright Star found herself thinking of all the stories still hidden in those patterns, all the lives and loves and losses waiting to be discovered by fingers patient enough to trace each thread to its source. That's why the weaving is so important, her grandmother continued, as if reading her thoughts. Stormwalker saw that the old ways of keeping memory, the songs, the dances, the stories told around winter fires, might not survive what was coming. But textile. She ran her palm across the section they had just completed, feeling the raised patterns with her fingertips. Textile can hide. Textile can travel. Textile can wait centuries for the right hands to touch it and understand its secrets. Bright Star leaned closer, studying the way the blue threads caught the firelight. "Will you teach me the patterns, grandmother? All of them?" The old woman's hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of the question. Teaching the memory weaving was not something done lightly. It required not just skill with the loom and knowledge of the dyes, but the ability to hold an entire people's history in one's mind without losing a single thread of truth. "The learning takes many winters," she said carefully, "and these may be the last winters for such teaching." "What do you mean?" She who remembers all didn't answer directly. Instead, she began working a new section of the textile, darker threads now, brown and black, with occasional streaks of deep red. "This part tells of the visions your grandfather had before he walked the spirit path. Dreams of great canoes with white wings, carrying pale men across the endless waters. Dreams of sickness that spreads like wildfire, taking the young and strong, along with the old and weak. Dreams of our sacred places being forgotten, our languages falling silent." The fire in the longhouse crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the elm bark covering and whistling through the smoke hole above. Other families were gathered around their own fires, telling the old stories, preparing for the long winter ahead. None of them knew that this would be their last winter of innocence, the final season before their world changed forever. But the weaving hands knew. They had always known. "The textile must be finished before the snows melt," the old woman said, her voice growing urgent. "Every face, every story, every lesson our people have learned, it all must be preserved in the pattern. If I cannot finish it—" She trailed off, unwilling to speak the possibility aloud. Bright Star understood. If the memory textile remained incomplete, entire generations would be lost forever. Their stories would die with their grandmother, becoming nothing more than whispered fragments that would grow fainter with each passing season until they vanished entirely. As the night deepened, she who remembers all worked with renewed purpose. Her failing eyes struggled in the flickering firelight, but her hands moved with the confidence of decades. Red thread for the warrior who had defended their borders against raiders from the north. Yellow for the medicine woman who could cure even the white man's spotted sickness. Green for the great peace treaty that had united 5 clans under one council fire. Each thread was chosen with perfect precision. The red came from bloodroot dug during the full moon, when its power was strongest. The yellow was made from golden seal gathered at dawn, while the dew still held the first light. The green required a mixture of moss and copper water, aged in buried pots for an entire season. Colors were not merely decoration. They were medicine, magic, memory itself, made visible. "Grandmother," Bright Star said softly, "your eyes are growing tired. Should we continue tomorrow?" "Tomorrow may be too late." The old woman's hands never paused. "I can feel my sight dimming like embers under ash. Soon, I will have to rely on touch alone, and there are patterns that cannot be felt, only seen. The facial markings that show clan affiliation, the small symbols that record the phases of the moon during important events, the delicate spirals that mark the places where our ancestors emerge from the earth." As if responding to her words, The fire suddenly flared brighter, fed by a gust of wind from the smoke hole. In the enhanced light, Bright Star could see the full scope of the textile for the first time. It was enormous, large enough to cover the floor of the entire longhouse, and so intricate that she could spend hours examining any single section without exhausting its details. Here was the story of the first planting, when her ancestors had learned to cultivate the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, from the Corn Maiden herself. There was the tale of the Great Migration, when their people had followed the white deer through 1,000 miles of wilderness to reach this blessed valley. And there, still being woven, was the prophecy of the time of choosing, when their descendants would have to decide whether to preserve the old ways or embrace the new world coming from across the water. "The pattern is speaking to me," the old woman murmured, her voice taking on the distant quality she always had when the visions came. "I can see the threads extending beyond what I'm weaving now. I can see—" She paused, her shuttle hovering over the loom. "I can see a time when this textile will be all that remains of us, when children who carry our blood but not our language will touch these threads and try to understand what they mean." A chill ran through the longhouse that had nothing to do with the winter wind. Bright Star pulled her deer-hide cloak closer around her shoulders, but she could not shake the cold that seemed to come from inside her bones. "That won't happen," she said firmly. "We'll remember. We'll keep the stories alive." "Stories change, child. Each time they're told, they lose a little of their truth and gain a little of the teller's interpretation. But the textile holds the exact truth, frozen forever in the pattern. As long as these threads survive, our people survive." The old woman's hands began moving faster now, racing against time itself. The shuttle flew back and forth like a bird desperate to finish building its nest before the storm arrived. Thread after thread added to the pattern, creating a visual symphony of memory that seemed to pulse with life in the firelight. But then, disaster struck. A thread snapped, not from the tension, but from the old woman's trembling fingers applying just a little too much pressure. It was a crucial thread, one of the silver ones that marked the path of a sacred journey. Without it, an entire story would be incomplete, a gap in the family's memory that could never be properly filled. She who remembers all stared at the broken thread for a long moment, her hands frozen over the loom. In all her decades of weaving, she had never made such a mistake. It felt like an omen, a sign that perhaps the time for such preservation had already passed. "Can it be fixed?" Bright Star asked quietly. "Fixed, yes, but never the same." The old woman's voice carried the weight of defeat. "The break will always be visible, a reminder of imperfection, of failure." "Or," Bright Star said, surprising herself with her boldness, "it could be a reminder of humanity. Our ancestors weren't perfect either, were they? They made mistakes, learned from them, grew stronger. Maybe the break belongs in the pattern." The old woman looked at her great niece with something approaching wonder. Here was wisdom beyond her years, the kind of insight that suggested she might indeed be ready to learn the sacred art. "You're right," she said slowly. "The break is part of the story too, part of who we are." Her hands resumed their work, incorporating the broken thread into the pattern in a way that transformed flaw into beauty, mistake into meaning. The night stretched on, and the textile grew. Hunters' tales woven in brown and gold, love songs captured in pink and white, seasonal ceremonies marked with the colors of autumn leaves and spring flowers. The entire universe of the deer clan, reduced to threads and knots and careful arrangements of color that would speak to future generations long after the last native speaker had forgotten how to read their meaning. As dawn approached, she who remembers all felt her strength failing. Her hands, which had worked tirelessly through the night, began to shake with fatigue. Her eyes, strained beyond their limits, could barely distinguish one thread from another. The pattern swam before her vision like something seen underwater, beautiful but impossibly distant. "I cannot finish," she whispered, the words falling like stones into the quiet longhouse. "My hands have reached the end of their journey." But Bright Star was there, her young fingers steady and sure. "Then teach me the next pattern," she said. "Guide my hands as your grandmother once guided yours." And so, as the sun rose over the valley for what would be the last winter morning of the Old World, two pairs of hands worked the loom together. The young fingers following the ancient patterns, the old wisdom flowing through touch and whispered instruction into a new generation. The textile neared completion, just as the winter's first true blizzard began to howl outside. The final threads, silver and gold intertwined, formed the pattern that had waited 7 generations to be woven. The symbol of continuation, of stories passed from hand to hand across the bridge of time. When it was finished, she who remembers all traced the final pattern with her fingertips, reading through touch what her eyes could no longer see. Every thread was in its proper place. Every story had been preserved. Every face had been honored with its own unique arrangement of color and texture. "It is complete," she breathed. "The memory lives." But even as she spoke the words, she knew that completion was an illusion. The textile held their past, but the future remained unwritten. The threads that would tell of the coming changes, the adaptations and survivals and losses, had yet to be spun. Outside the longhouse, the blizzard raged with a fury that seemed almost personal, as if the very spirits of winter were trying to bury the old world beneath a blanket of white. But inside, the textile lay spread across the floor like a map of time itself, its patterns glowing in the firelight with all the warmth and wisdom of a people who had learned to preserve their deepest truths in the most beautiful way they knew how. The weaving hands had done their work. The story would survive, thread by thread, pattern by pattern, until someone in a distant future learned to read their language of memory and brought the ancestors back to life once more. And in that moment of completion, as the old woman's eyes finally closed and her hands grew still, the textile seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, not the reflection of flames, but the luminescence of stories that refuse to die, of love that transcends time, of hands that keep weaving even when their work seems done. The memory lived. The pattern was complete. And somewhere in the threads that caught the firelight like captured stars, 7 generations of the Deer clan smiled and danced and sang their Thanksgiving songs, knowing that as long as even one thread remained, they would never truly be forgotten. The last normal winter was ending, but the story, the eternal, unbreakable story, would continue forever.